Welcome, everyone. I want to thank you for joining us, our webinar on trauma-informing suicide prevention webinar today. My name is Heidi Bryan, and I'm going to tell you more about myself and Leah and the webinar, but first I just want to go through a few little items. All the attendees should be muted, so I don't think you need to worry about your cell phones or anything like that, but but if not, I'll make sure that you're muted if I hear something in the background. We're going to be leaving time at the end of the webinar for questions. At that point, you can either raise your hand or write a question in the chat, and they'll be answered. As we go through the webinar too, if you want to answer something, if you want to ask a question, feel free to type it in. But I won't be interrupting Leah. I want her to finish her material, and then after that, I'll ask her the questions that you've written in. So I think that's it that I wanted to talk about. So let's begin. Again, my name is Heidi Bryan, and I'm the host and organizer of this webinar. I've been involved in suicide prevention since 1998 after losing my older brother to suicide. I founded and ran the organization called Feeling Blue Suicide Prevention Council, and it's now morphed into Prevent Suicide Pennsylvania. And I'm currently, I have my own consulting business now in Wisconsin. I'm a person with lived experience. I'm a suicide attempt survivor. I still struggle with chronic suicidal ideation, and I have been diagnosed with, among other things, post-PTSD. Since I first got involved in suicide prevention, I felt that that trauma-informed care and just the whole area around trauma has been somewhat overlooked in suicide prevention. We know that history of abuse and trauma is a risk factor, and it's also my belief that suicides and suicide attempts are traumatic and they need to be treated as such. I recently embarked on this producing, hosting, holding webinars, and I thought, you know what, I'm just going to hold a webinar on topics that are passionate to me. So as soon as I decided to do this particular webinar, I knew I wanted Leah Harris to present, and I was just so happy that when she just so readily agreed to do so. Leah has her master's degree, is a mother and advocate, and suicide attempt survivor also, who has written and spoken widely about her experiences of trauma, addiction, serious mental health challenges, and resilience. She's also a member of the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline Consumer Survivor Committee and the Zero Suicide Initiative faculty, and provides training and technical assistance with the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration's National Center for Trauma-Informed Care. She's also the CEO and founder of her own consulting business, Shifa Consulting, and I think she can tell you more about that. I think she includes a bit of it about that in her presentation. So without further ado, I am going to give you Leah. So as soon as I can find her.
Oh.
Okay. I got it.
Did you find me?
Yeah.
All right. Okay. Fantastic. All right. Can you all see my screen?
I can, so I think others can.
Okay. Okay. Hopefully others can. Great. Let us know if not. Awesome. Awesome. Well, first of all, I just want to thank you so much, Heidi. You truly have been a pioneer in elevating the voices of suicide attempt survivors and really asserting that we also are experts and have expertise in our own lives and our own experiences. So thank you for having me.
Thanks.
You bet. All right. So our time together today is short, and I'm going to try to share with you as much as I can and also keep it as interactive as I can within this interesting sort of communication platform. So we'll start off with me telling just a little bit of my own story, how I sort of came to do the work that I do. But what I really want to focus on is this very important, and as Heidi mentioned, I feel underexamined, underexplored intersection between traumatic experience and suicide attempts, struggling with suicidal thoughts and feelings. And then I will point you in the direction of some strategies for trauma resolution and healing. The kinds of workshops that I tend to do, kind of really digging into looking at trauma-informed care in detail, tend to be at least a whole day. So I'm going to try to pack in what I can and point you in further directions for what I can't discuss right now. And then finally, we're going to give some opportunity for your questions and your comments, which I'm very much looking forward to. All right, so I call these two images side by side my childhood in a nutshell. And I feel like these images really do tell a lot of the story, at least up until a certain point in my life. On the left, I am really laughing and smiling. I'm in foster care at that point. And that smile and that laughter is actually, layered on top of a lot of trauma that I had already experienced. I'm 3 years old in this picture. My 0 to 5 years were pretty much rotating in and out of foster care, various family members' couches and spare bedrooms. My mother was a wonderful, brilliant, beautiful soul who was diagnosed with schizophrenia when she was 18 and really struggled to raise me all on her own. We lived in inner city Milwaukee in a lot of poverty. And, as much as my family tried to help, it was more than really anyone was equipped to handle. There was no mobile crisis. There was no sort of in-home support. There was no peer support for families or parents who are struggling with mental health challenges. So unfortunately, as I rotated in and out of foster care, my mother rotated in and out of various psychiatric wards. My father had his own mental health issues and wasn't in the picture, so it was pretty much just me and Mama. Unfortunately, I was removed from her custody when I was 5 years old, and I went to live with my maternal grandmother and her second husband very far away, and that was quite a rupture. That's another form of trauma, abrupt parental separations. And so, I really remember the first time I was suicidal. I was 7 years old, and I remember very clearly feeling like it was an absolute mistake that I was born, that I'm here. It would be so much better if I wasn't here. I really didn't know or understand what suicide was or what it would look like, but I remember that feeling like not supposed to be here, don't want to be here. Why the hell am I here? And that, just spiraled and progressed. Everybody knew about my early childhood trauma and the challenges I had gone through. I was receiving some measures of psychiatric assistance, but there was really, nobody was addressing the elephant in the room, which was the trauma that I had faced as a young girl. So as a result, I just started to spiral in and out of this cycle that probably many of you recognize. Struggling with suicide attempts, drug addiction, all kinds of behaviors that are called quote-unquote risky, but made me feel alive, just getting into trouble of all various kinds. And I really started to internalize this idea that I'm broken, I'm damaged. My grandmother, bless her heart, may she rest in peace, when I came to live with her, she told me, you came to us damaged goods. That was just the prevailing attitude. So when you get to this picture on the right, I'm just almost 17 years old, rocking my Jim Morrison tie-dye retro t-shirt. And in this picture, I'm in residential treatment, where I was there for over a year. And in this picture, they said, smile big. And I asked, why should I, what is this for? And they said, well, if you try to run, we're going to give this photograph to all the local police, and if you try to run away from here, we'll have APB out on you so fast you won't know it hit you. And that was my orientation to the residential treatment facility. Just don't run away. And so, on and on it went, a cycle of destruction, self-destruction, no hope, not seeing a way out. And I, just through a series of events that I do not have time to recount on this webinar, I was able to break the cycle. My last stop was a group home when I was 18 years old, where I was told I would not be able to live or function outside of that group home. And I just refused to believe it. My last suicide attempt was in that group home. And there was the part of me that wanted to live, and somehow that part managed to get me the hell out of there. And it was a miracle. And, I'll talk to you a little bit about the resilience piece. So, I feel like before we get into trauma, I want to talk about the fact that regardless of what people used to think and what people think perhaps nowadays, regardless of how serious trauma is, it can always be healed, and I am a firm believer in that. There's no one-size-fits-all path to healing, but I really want to emphasize that trauma is not destiny. That's what I grew up thinking, and it was totally wrong. I'll tell you what the things that saved me, and I feel like these are the things that helped me with my trauma were the same things that helped me with my suicidal struggles. I will not tell you that I never have a suicidal thought. Yes, I do have suicidal thoughts still, but I do not consider that a failing of any of the supports or the work that I've done. I know how to work with those thoughts today. I know that I don't need to take action on those thoughts today. And those are all skills and tools that I've built up over the last several decades of my life. So first of all, relationships, and I'm going to talk more about that later, but people stepping in, showing up at crucial times, telling me things even when I didn't believe it, like the high school teacher I had who came and visited me when I was locked up in residential treatment and said, I believe you're going to get out of here and you're going to go on and you're going to write. And in my mind, I was like, you're full of it. No, I'm not. But that must have stuck somewhere. That one person who said, you're not a broken, damaged mental patient, suicidal mental patient. Like, these are the things that I see are possible for you. And those were not messages I was getting from the mental health system. I know there's been a lot of movement towards fostering cultures of resilience and recovery, but that was not happening in any of the placements I was in as a youth. It really wasn't until I was in my late 20s, early 30s, and the sort of remnants of my childhood trauma just continued to rise up, and I could not suppress them no matter what I did, as I began to bring my body to the equation. And I'll talk more about that as well. 99% of our current mental health treatment acts like we don't have bodies. It's all neck up. And when I talk to you about trauma and you understand how trauma works, sometimes talking is not enough. We need to get at what is going on with the body, where's the trauma in the body, and bringing our entire holistic selves to the healing process. And my trauma, the trauma treatment that I finally did get, and it wasn't until my 30s, and it was only because at that point in my life I could actually afford it, taught me these kinds of things. Creative expression has been a tremendous part of my healing process, and I'll talk more about that as well. Storytelling has been almost everything for me. It's not just sharing my story like I am with you all right now, but it's been that process of really looking at what are the stories that I tell myself, what are the things I've internalized, and can I begin to start shifting, rewriting some of those stories. And then finally, advocacy and activism. I just feel every single day endless gratitude that I get to turn my quote-unquote mess into my message, that I have the opportunity to connect with so many other incredible people who are doing this work, and actually try to foster some change in the way that we do things. And oh, by the way, that's on the right, that's my little baby who's now 12, but he'll still always be my baby. I'd be very embarrassed if I told you that right now. All right, so transitioning, you know, there's this thing that I'm really excited about, and it's taking two terms that are rarely put together and putting them together, which is trauma-informed and suicide prevention. And I've been really kind of gung-ho on this for quite a while. And I actually got the idea to put the two rings together like that. This was in 2015 when same-sex marriage was legislated, and I was like so excited about it. I had to create the wedding ring graphics to go with it. So, turning to reality. I don't need to tell any of you on this call the state of suicide in our nation today, particularly as compared with around the world. We know that we are facing 30-year highs in suicides, you know, and that we have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of wonderful people who are doing everything they can to bring those numbers down. And I, you know, I really believe in this zero suicide philosophy, that one suicide is too many. So I think that this graph is another way of really illustrating where we're at. And this was, I first saw this from the former director of the National Institute for Mental Health, whose name is Tom Insel. And he showed that if you really look at some of the major causes of death, or some of the sort of looking at mortality from medical causes, that almost every, you know, major medical public health issue, we have seen a sort of nice, we want to see that nice diagonally downward facing curve, right? But when we look at suicide, I don't see a whole lot of a slant or a slope there. You know, and I think Dr. Insel said it all. We have failed to bend the curve when it comes to suicide prevention. We have to shift this paradigm. And again, this is not to say that the amazing work that people are doing is not enough. It's nothing like that. Just to say that something that we as a field collectively are doing is not working. And we need to be honest with ourselves as a field and think about why that is and what we might begin to try to do differently. So really shifting into the meat of this, really looking at trauma-informed suicide prevention. We're going to test out this technology and see if it works. But I want to ask you, when I say that word, when I use the T word, the trauma word, I'd love to hear from folks on the phone, or participating. Feel free to chat like a word or a phrase into the chat box. You know, when I say this word, what does that signify to you? And I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it. What do you associate with trauma? And Heidi, I'm not seeing anything in the chat. Are you? I just want to make sure I'm not missing anything. If you guys are still thinking about it, that's totally fine. I'll just give you another couple seconds, and otherwise I'll move on. I know I'm putting you on the spot here. All right. Well, I'm not seeing anything yet, so I'm assuming y'all are still thinking, and I will, in the interest of time, give you the answer or an answer. So this definition actually comes from SAMHSA. They've done a whole lot of work, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, really reaching out to the field over the last several years, and you know, coming up with definitions and ways and concepts with a lot of input from the field. So this is one definition that they've come up with that's called the 3 E's, and I find it's a useful framework. When we're looking at individual trauma, because there's also, you know, intergenerational trauma, historical trauma, collective trauma, all these things we can talk about, but looking on the individual level for now, resulting from an event or a series of events or a set of circumstances that's experienced by someone as harmful, whether physically or emotionally, or there may be some component of feeling that one's life is under threat. And then the third part is really important because I feel like we kind of banter trauma around in our popular culture in a way that's not quite accurate. But really understanding that there are lasting adverse or negative effects on the way a person is navigating the world, whether on the mental, physical, social, emotional, or spiritual levels. So it creates these kinds of negative effects on a person's life. But again, I do want to emphasize that none of this is destiny, and these things can be shifted, transformed, resolved, and healed. Oops. All right, so just to show you, a couple statistics, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. Usually when I talk to people, I say, particular providers in mental health or substance use, is it shocking to you that the vast majority of people that you work with have experienced trauma? And overwhelmingly, the answer is no. I'm not surprised by that information at all. Hands down, people are saying yes. Like everyone that I'm working with has experienced some kind of trauma. And, you can see it here with some of these numbers. Looking at juvenile justice, 94% of children have experienced trauma, according to one study. Looking at sexual abuse numbers, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys, right? 71% of children exposed to violence each year. I mean, these are the realities. And looking at adults, what are the impacts, again, when that childhood trauma is not addressed or if it's ongoing, right? So there's all kinds of consequences, right, for our system. They have more severe issues that they're struggling with. I want to draw your attention to this fourth point here, greater likelihood of self-injury or suicide attempts. Unfortunately, more time in seclusion and restraint in mental health settings, which we need to just get rid of seclusion and restraint in mental health settings. But more frequent and longer hospital stays. So you're just seeing this sort of cascading, right, series of effects. And when we're really looking at what is a trauma-informed approach, right, I think that these are some really important points that, we really try to hammer home in the trainings that I do with the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care and elsewhere. Is that we're really shifting, and I'm sure if you've had any exposure to trauma-informed care, you've heard it's not what's wrong with you, it's what happened to you, right? And those are two very, very different questions. I feel like a lot of what I went through in the mental health system was what's wrong with you, even though they knew what happened to me, right? So shifting that question and understanding that even if this person is not sharing anything with you, we know that the prevalence of trauma is so great and so strong in our mental health services that you can bet that that person has experienced some form of traumatic experience, whether or not they're sharing it with you. So what happened to you? And then moving away from seeing symptoms as sort of meaningless pathology of a disordered brain, right? Right, which is so often how we see those symptoms, right? To understanding that there is meaning in that behavior, there's meaning in whatever that person's experiencing, and that is actually more often than not an adaptation to traumatic events. So when people looked at my substance use, as a symptom of my overall kind of mental health cascading series of disorders, substance use for me was an adaptation to traumatic events. It helped me to shut out some of what I was experiencing on the mind, body, spirit level. And then finally, healing happens in relationships, and I'm going to talk a lot more about this as well. But this is not just like fuzzy-wuzzy, kumbaya, let's all love each other kind of sentiment. It's really based in hard neuroscience that has found that our need to bond and to connect is one of the greatest of human needs, and that doesn't stop when we enter the healthcare system for whatever reason. So Again, this comes from SAMHSA, this framework, just to kind of help you unpack it a little bit more. That really looking at this idea of there are 3 E's in trauma. The first one being the events, which we've talked about, events or circumstances, and then how that person experiences the event, and then again, effects that I've mentioned to all of you. So again, I'm not going to go through all of these in great detail, but these are just some examples of potential traumatic events, right? If we're looking at this framework of events, experience, and effects, these are just some of them, all of the things we would think of with abuse, domestic violence. I think an important point here is that it's not just having a personal experience of violence, but witnessing violence can also be in and of itself traumatic. All of these things that we now know about bullying and cyberbullying and the effects on people, these are traumatic as well. So it can be our peers who are abusing us, right? And institutional. And I think that that's a really important one that does not get brought up enough. But we know that in all of our settings where there are people with mental health issues, people who are struggling with suicide, there is the potential for abuse, particularly in our jails, prisons, and inpatient psychiatric facilities. So understanding how it is completely a compounding of the trauma when we come in already struggling with something, and then we experience something like seclusion, like restraint, like involuntary confinement. None of these things are therapeutic in any way. And then the next category is loss, which I think would also make sense to all of you that, it's anything from death, abandonment, neglect, forms of separation, the ongoing effects of natural disaster and how people are forced to relocate, and that sense of cultural dislocation, all of these kinds of things, accidents, terrorism, war. And then I think we're starting to understand more about the chronic stressors that impact the body and the mind and the whole person in the same way as these other kinds of traumas, right? So we know that poverty is traumatic, racism, every ism, every phobia, all of those things are traumatic for people to live under and experience, right? Even things like medical procedures, right? Community level traumas that happen, whether it's from natural disasters or from mass violence or whatever it might be. And historical trauma, which I'm going to talk about in more detail. So understanding that there's this whole range of potential traumatic events. And the experience is affected by how it happened, right? So me falling down the stairs is going to be traumatic. It's going to be painful, it's going to be scary. But if I am pushed down the stairs by someone who says that they love me, how much further is that going to be compounded, right? That whole experience that's in and of itself unpleasant, right? And when it happens, we know that particularly experiences that happen under the age of 5 can have a particularly strong imprint on us. Where and how often, all of these things can matter. And who is the other piece that I should say on here. I don't know how many of you remember when you went to school hearing about stranger danger. But we know that the vast majority of people who are likely to hurt a child are not going to be strangers. It's going to be someone that this child knows, right? So it's not stranger danger. So understanding how much more violating it is when, again, these acts are committed by someone who's supposed to be loving and or caring for us. So let's see if we can try this again. Let's see if we can try a little engagement in the chat box. Maybe folks are feeling more warmed up here. I'm bouncing back to too many windows. Here we go. So why might an experience be traumatic? And I'll fix these slides, I'm sorry. Why would an experience be traumatic for one person and not another? I'm just curious if any of you have any thoughts on that, given everything I've talked about so far. Any thoughts on that? Just do like a word or a phrase. Yeah, and I'm not seeing anything, so I'll just give it another couple seconds to see if anybody wants to chime in on this question. If not, I will move on. All right, let me get myself together here. Sorry about that, y'all. Okay. So yeah, why might something be traumatic for one person, not another? I guess I should answer that since I asked y'all. And again, I think it comes down to sort of what I talked about in the previous slide. You know, when did it happen? How did it happen, right? Was it like an innocent sort of experience, or was it deliberate act of violence committed against someone, right? All of these kinds of things, as well as whatever kinds of resilience factors that person has available to them, right? Like, do they have a support system, or do they not, right? So I'll give you an example. I think that brings us down a little bit more down to earth. There was a study that was done on people who had lived through September 11th versus people who lived through Hurricane Katrina. And they found that the incidence of people who kind of had lasting, you know, post-traumatic stress symptoms or experiences was much higher in the people who had survived Katrina. And there's a couple of fascinating reasons as to why. The first one being that the people who were escaping, the people who were lucky enough to get out of the World Trade Center, where were they escaping to? They were going home, right? They were going home to their families, to their loved ones, to a familiar place, right? So they were going home. Secondly, there was all of this national outpouring and understanding and support, national, international, right? So they're surrounded by, you know, people who are saying, you know, you're brave, we believe in you, you know, all of these kinds of positive messages, right? Whereas if you look at the experience of Katrina, right, people were dislocated. There's lots of people to this day have not been able to return to their homes, right, and will never return to their homes. There was attention on Katrina, sure, but not on the people that were most viciously affected, who were the people who could not afford to get out, right? So, you know, just a different sort of level of receiving, understanding, and then again, this sense of losing home, right, which is so traumatic. So yeah, so looking at effect, and that, again, I think I talked about this, you know, the idea that it is, these are adaptations to traumatic experience, right? And I think of it as a normal response to an abnormal situation. I think this is a very, very important point because I really think that we need to stop pathologizing the coping mechanisms of people who are trauma survivors, understanding they are doing the best they can to cope, and, you know, how we can be supportive is to help them to discover alternative coping strategies, right, that aren't going to have such dangerous and destructive effects. So again, here's another way of looking at this, right? When we look at sort of those really kind of basic survival skills that come in for people, right, in a traumatic situation, so fight, flight, or freeze. I'm sure most of you have heard of that, right? So those are the different ways that we sort of automatically respond to traumatic situations, right? And if the trauma is continuing over time and our body never has a chance to release the trauma, then these can become sort of ongoing states for people, right? I definitely know for me, I wasn't a big fighter, but I fled and I froze a lot, right? And I still struggle with different forms of fleeing and freezing, you know, and I'm working on that. So it's, you know, and these are some of the ways that people get labeled and pathologized, right? So here's some ideas about how we can maybe start shifting the way we think and think about these things and understand these things, right? So is a person non-compliant and combative, or maybe they're struggling to hold on to some power, right? Could that be another way to look at how this person is acting right now? Yes, again, I got that label: treatment resistant, uncooperative, all that stuff, or, you know, disengaging, withdrawing, yada, yada, right? these are forms of flight, right? They're withdrawing to protect themselves, right? And then freeze, right? It's I'm sure you've heard folks described as like passive, unmotivated, all this kind of thing, or are they giving in to those in power, right? What is that freeze response other than a survival mechanism? Hoping if I don't rock this boat, I'm going to survive this, right? So from here, I want to just segue quickly into talking about the adverse childhood experiences study, because this really does get to the more of the science, and I want to make sure I give you lots of science in here. But for those of you who aren't familiar, the adverse childhood experiences study actually is 20 years old this year. It was done in 1997 as a collaboration between Kaiser Permanente and the Centers for Disease Control. And the ACE questionnaire is 10 yes or no questions that looks at 3 types of adverse childhood experiences. And so I want to emphasize, these are things that have happened under the age of 18, and we're only looking at what is happening in the immediate family. The adverse childhood experiences study does not look beyond parental incarceration. It doesn't really look at the policies or sort of what's happening in the broader world that is contributing to adverse childhood experiences, or what might be happening in the community or in the school. Like, none of that is captured here, so just so you know. So basically asking 3 questions about abuse, 2 about neglect, and then looking at different forms of what is called household dysfunction. I wouldn't use that language, but that's what they used in 97. So is there a parent who is not getting any help or support for a mental health challenge, right? Or is there an incarcerated relative? Or is this child witnessing domestic violence, right? And then is there a parent who's struggling with drugs and alcohol, or is there divorce in the family, right? So those are the 10 questions. And so they surveyed 17,000 people in the state of California in 1997, and what they found just by distributing this questionnaire was really shocking. So looking at, the 2 big findings is number 1, that adverse childhood experiences were way more common than anybody ever thought. So I think 40% of the people studied had 2 or more adverse childhood experiences. But if you look on that scale of 1 to 10, because it's a 10-point questionnaire, the higher your ACE score on a scale of 1 to 10, the greater likelihood of all of these kinds of things happening. Mental health issues, all the stuff I talked about when I told you my own story, right? Health risk behaviors, social problems, adult disease and disability, right? The astronomical, costs that are associated with people not getting the right kind of help, and then life expectancy, right? These are all things that they discovered. And then if we want to look at adverse childhood experiences specifically connected to suicide, this was studied. There's been subsequent studies. But if you look at it's called a dose response. Am I saying that right? Something like that. But basically, a strong graded relationship. So the higher the ACE score, the stronger the possibility of suicide attempts during youth and adulthood. Dose-response relationship, that's what I'm looking for. And then an ACE score of 7 or more, I think that this is really just shocking, is that we looked at an increased risk of suicide attempts 51-fold with kids and 30-fold among adolescents. And you can look that up for yourself. And so really what the study found is that 2/3 of the suicide attempts that they saw among the participating adults were attributable, connected with adverse childhood experiences, of 80% during childhood. This is, my personal belief, Leah Harris. I think that focusing on adverse childhood experiences and reducing adverse childhood experiences is suicide prevention. Even though we're not calling it that, it is one of the most important forms of suicide prevention there is, I believe. And until we have, really a concerted attempt to address early childhood adversity, we won't have the data to prove me right, but I'd like to think I'm correct about that. And so here's another representation where you can see that dose-response relationship with, you know, the higher the ACE score, the percentage of attempts throughout childhood and adulthood. And this is actually a study that just came out. So the ACE information is older, however, it's been replicated in over 28 states, and they found similar findings. But this just came out this year in the Lancet Public Health. That is it's a meta-analysis of all of the research that they could find on multiple adverse childhood experiences and how they affect health. And I just found this so fascinating because I feel like it's like the biggest issues in our society that seem to be intractable are the ones with the greatest association with multiple adverse childhood experiences, which, as we have established through the science of the ACE study, we know these are tremendously common. So these are not, you know, just a few people here and there. That people who have multiple adverse childhood experiences are common. We all know them. So depression, drug use, alcohol use, STIs, violence of all kinds, right? Drug use and suicide attempts. And in fact, you know, and this is just another way of saying it, is that, you know, we're really looking at, if we're not addressing these issues, that we're just perpetuating this throughout the generations, right? And that's the part that I think I'm so passionate about, is that I do believe that these cycles can be disrupted. But I think we need to understand that these issues are not just medical; they're also political. You know, they're socioeconomic. You know, they have to do with race, they have to do with class, they have to do with our economic everything. All the things that we don't want to look at and that we think aren't connected to suicide prevention per se. So yeah, and I think, you know, I love the conclusion that they come to, is that you know, we need to focus on preventing adverse childhood experiences. We need to be intentionally promoting resilience, right, on a whole bunch of different levels. And this is something that I'm super, super passionate about. So just getting back a little bit to my own story, part of my own process of healing from trauma, or sort of understanding patterns that have been, you know, passed down in my family, I had to do a lot of work looking back through the generations. So you can see on the left, that's my great-grandfather Max Schumacher, and my great-grandmother Ida. And you know, the reason I'm talking about this is really looking at the impact of historical trauma, and there's an absolute relevance and connection to suicide and suicide prevention, which I'll get to. But without, you know, going into the whole story, I'll just give you one sort of vignette that I think encapsulates the family story. My grandmother, who raised me, whenever she talked about her father, she would talk about him. You know, he had the voice of an angel. He sang in the Yiddish theater. You know, he was just this like larger-than-life heroic figure. And on the right, you can see him in his uniform. Soon after coming to this country, escaping anti-Jewish oppression in Poland and Russia, he enlisted in World War I. And again, you know, fleeing oppression, you know, it's got to be traumatic. Entering the military, he was wounded in the military. He became wounded and disabled in the military. So more trauma, right? So as my grandmother referred to him, he was this larger-than-life, talented, gifted, brilliant person, and her mother was this quiet woman who adored him, right? That was her perspective. And when she passed away, I had the opportunity to talk to her younger brother, who's also no longer with us, but he told me that my grandmother was basically delusional, and that Grandpa Max was all of those things. I mean, he was, you know, active in the Yiddish theater, and he was talented, and all of these things. He was also a violent alcoholic, and there was a reign of terror in the family home, right? And when we get back to this idea of symptoms as adaptations, you know, not excusing his behavior, but understanding that he turned to alcohol, as so many of us do, to tamp down those unpleasant sensations that are associated with trauma, right? Those unpleasant experiences. And it had this intergenerational effect on our family. You know, I don't know much going back further than that, but that's what I know. So when we look at historical trauma, right, it's something that is observed in many populations, Native American populations, the African American experience with slavery, Jim Crow, and everything that's continuing to go on, Holocaust survivors, descendants of refugees of all kinds, right? Japanese American internment camp survivors, all kinds of populations can experience this, right? So we're looking at ongoing historical trauma that happens over the lifespan and across generations, right? So, you know, when she talks about that massive group trauma, right, it's displacement, genocide, all of these kinds of things that have these reverberations that go over and over through the generations, right? And this is research coming from Maria Yellow Horse Braveheart, who is a wonderful social worker and researcher who's done a lot of work around this. And another resource I would recommend to you is a book called Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome by Dr. Joy DeGruy-Leary. So there's this historical trauma, and then there's this sort of epigenetic inheritance, right? And when I first heard this, I didn't want to believe that it was true. But the more that I've read about it and studied about it, I've started to understand where the hope is here. So first of all, understanding that the experiences of our ancestors actually can affect how our genes express themselves and how our brain sort of processes the world. And that there's evidence to show, based on the work of Rachel Yehuda and others, that, for example, the children of Holocaust survivors or the descendants of Holocaust survivors, they've actually found an increased stress, a vulnerability to stress, which to me always seemed counterintuitive. It's like you're the descendant of someone who survived such horrors, but yet there's this increased vulnerability in future generations, but that's how it seems to be playing out. Again, our brains are neuroplastic. We can absolutely heal and begin to heal these things and be part of disrupting cycles of trauma and violence. But I think it's important to kind of understand these legacies and these various forms of heritage. Oh, I feel like I'm hearing a little, there was an echo, but it's gone away. Okay, so epigenetics and suicide. So when we look at, this epigenetic experience of how, your great-grandmother's generation, how their experiences can impact the way subsequent generations, their genes express themselves. So in this paper, they actually looked at the brains of people who had died by suicide versus other factors. And they did find that if the person who had died by suicide had been abused as a child, their brains had increased methylation of the genes in their brain, right? And that's in the hippocampus, which is critical to memory acquisition and stress response. So there's, again, what I was talking about, this increased vulnerability to stress and struggling with suicide and indeed completing suicide. And to sort of look at this on another level, I think we need to be looking at and talking about much more, this idea of racism's toll on mental health, right? So, this has really been an overlooked factor for children of color, in our country, and that, I think it is a contributor to the suicide rates and self-harm, that we're seeing with young people of color. And I don't have a slide for this, but conversely, this is why I want to talk about policy too. I'm not going to go way into the policy, but when there's policies that perpetuate oppression, we see that happening in people's mental health and perhaps in suicide ideation. On the going back to the same-sex marriage example that I brought up earlier, there was a study, and I apologize not having a slide, but I just thought of it now and I wanted to share it. There was a study that showed that in states that had adopted or endorsed same-sex marriage, trans and LGBT youth, there was actually a decrease in suicide among LGBT youth in those states that had adopted same-sex marriage legislation. And what the researchers, the conclusion that they drew is that sort of big expression of acceptance, right, that yes, you are as deserving of love and marriage and all the benefits that go with that as everybody else, that sent such a positive message to these young queer youth that it reduced the suicide rate. Now, was that legislation introduced to affect suicide rates? No. But this just shows you how when we as a society become more accepting, more inclusive, that it does have an impact on suicide. I don't see our country moving in that direction right now, but it's just something to think about. So healing from trauma, and so this is the piece that I really want to make sure that we have plenty of time to talk about as well. There's a few things that should ideally be in place for healing from trauma, and one of them is having a sense of control over one's life and one's environment. How this is connected to suicide and suicide prevention. I can tell you that as soon as I was determined to be a danger to myself, I lost all control over my life and my body and my environment. And how that sort of compounded my sense of trauma, right? And that this so often is the case that, when we seek to control rather than comfort, we take away control from that individual, right? Maintaining a sense of safety, and that's hard to do. We don't have a perfectly safe world, right? But what are some ways, and I think this gets to some of the mind-body skills work that has been so life-changing for me, to have a safe sense at least of safety within the boundaries of our own body, if that makes sense, right? So that sense of internal safety is really kind of what I think of here. Developing the ability to trust oneself and to trust others and reconnecting, okay? And I think that this is so important because I really look at trauma as a pervasive experience of disconnection, particularly if trauma has been perpetrated by people who are supposed to love us, right? And how does that disconnect us from people? How does that make it so difficult for us to trust people and to know who's trustworthy and who isn't? How difficult is it to trust ourselves given all of the sort of negative messages so many of us have received about, you caused this, why did you dress like that? Like blaming and shaming messages, or that didn't happen, messages of erasure. And so, I see so much of the work of healing trauma and supporting people to not be controlled by suicidal thoughts and urges, is that process of reconnection. And again, I talked about the mental health system, and the prevailing paradigm is based on neck up, right? There's a mind-body disconnection that's going on as well for so many people. And I really encourage folks to look at this engaging women in trauma-informed peer support, because I feel like there's just a wealth of beautiful wisdom in this guide, whether you are a peer supporter or you work with women or you don't. So much in here is universal about how do we really support people in a trauma-informed way, and how do we bring that to relationships. So I wanted to spend the rest of my time looking at the healing piece, and a framework that I have found to be tremendously helpful for me is this 4 truths of healing that has been put forth by Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who's one of the foremost trauma experts in the world, and someone I have an enormous amount of respect for his very holistic understanding. He's a psychiatrist. And, you know, one of the things that he says, and this is not, you know, an either or I'm not trying to tell people what they should or shouldn't do, but, you know, he was a very sort of traditional psychiatrist, and he sort of came to this realization for many of the people he was working with who were struggling with trauma, not all, but that he always says, they didn't need meds stat, they need a yoga mat stat, you know, and this is from a very sort of stuffy, I don't mean to say that, but, you know, sort of traditional, you know, a medical professional who kind of viewed things through the traditional medical model. And he really became a convert to looking at these things in a holistic way, because he saw how much they were helping the people that he was working with. So these 4 truths of healing, and this is so powerful. Our capacity to destroy each other is matched by our capacity to heal each other. And I think, oh my gosh, like, what a message that we need today, right? Restoring relationships and community is central to well-being. You know, and he works with people with severe trauma. You know, this is not people who've had a couple of rough days in their lives, right? So he's really looking at this from the perspective of people who've experienced severe and complex trauma, and the importance of relationships and community building. And, you know, I don't need to tell you all, like, social isolation is absolutely a killer in all ways. You know, we know that. You know, I think the question is, how do we create community, and how do we bring forth opportunities for people to connect with one another in a whole variety of ways? That's just a cool little image. So, you know, the second truth is really, to me, gets to the piece around sharing our story. And I think that this is so absolutely critical. Language gives us the power to change ourselves and others by communicating our experiences, helping us to define what we know, and finding a common sense of meaning. When I first started working in suicide prevention, I guess it's been about 10 years now, a little bit more. It was very rare for me to hear the stories of other survivors. Other attempt survivors, I should say specifically. By then, the lost survivors movement was pretty well established, and there are lots of lost survivor support groups, and you know, they were a presence in DC, and you know, kind of building and consolidating their movement. But I didn't really hear from many survivors. I mean, attempt survivors, there were like a handful of people. But I know from my own experience that hearing the stories of others has really given me permission to share my own, and to sort of overcome the deep shame that I was carrying around all the time. I mean, I was just filled with shame. And until I, you know, came out as someone with a mental health issue, with a history of suicide attempts, it was very hard for me to really be authentic and real with people. I didn't let people in. People only knew as much about me as I allowed, and I held them at arm's length. So I think that for me, this is one of the most sort of powerful pieces around storytelling, and it's very connected with peer support as well. In fact, if we look at peer support, one of the requirements for the job description is that you are willing to share aspects of your own lived experience with the people that you're working with, or with you know, folks that your colleagues, right? So, you know, and I've just been a huge fan and proponent of storytelling in all of its different forms. I know for me, the shift from having other people narrate my story for me in like medical records that I may or may not have access to, and if I have access to them, like 98% of what's in there is redacted and not really a liberatory kind of thing. But when I started to tell my own story in my own words, through poetry, through connecting with my fellow survivors, you know, just like stories that get shared, you know, over coffee, I felt a freedom to be who I am, to not have to hide any aspect of who I am. And that was everything for me. I truly don't know what I would have done if I didn't find this, tiny tribe of survivors and people who are kind of speaking out and trying to change systems, right? So I think, the other piece that's really important to look at this is we love to talk about stigma in mental health or when it comes to suicide. We love to talk about stigma and end the stigma, stop the stigma. And the truth is that the lots of ways that we talk about mental health actually increase the stigma. What does actually reduce it, what does actually change attitudes is when everyday people share their own process of healing and recovery. It has been shown to be superior to education, like, let me tell you about suicide and trauma, or any other sort of form of messaging. These stories from people that you can relate to. So celebrities are also great. So here's an example. I am like a huge Mary Lambert fan. And this is, just one example, where I think it was earlier this year where she kind of came out in an even deeper way around her connections with trauma and suicide attempts, and everything that she's doing in her music and in her life and in her public persona is about showing others their worth, and I think that, oh my gosh, like that's just the best thing that we can be doing is showing people their worth, because I can tell you, as someone who struggled with suicide, who struggled with mental health issues and drugs, I truly believed that I was worthless. I did not think that I was someone worth saving, and I really didn't think that I needed to be here. And it wasn't until I learned to really stop hustling for my worthiness and to just step into it that I began to take risks that were positive for me rather than the kind of risks I had been taking that were sort of death-defying risks. And I hope that everyone on the line, all 100-something of you, is familiar with livethroughthis.org. If not, please jump on there as soon as we're done with this webinar. But I just can't say enough about how much I appreciate this project. It was started by Desiree Stage. I'm thinking most of you are familiar with Desiree and her work, but what I think is so powerful about this is that as much as we love the Mary Lamberts of the world and the celebrities who kind of come out and talk about their experiences, in a way it's sort of easier for them because they're shielded, right? They're surrounded by privilege and wealth. They're sort of shielded from some of the consequences, right? But these are ordinary, everyday people, just like you and me. And when I talked earlier about the research coming from Patrick Corrigan and others, these are the stories that change hearts and minds. Everyday people that look like you, that you can relate to. So we need a lot more of these kinds of projects that give people the opportunity to tell their story, to be seen. I heard Desiree talk about why do you always have your portraits or your subjects, the people you've interviewed, why do you always have them looking straight into the camera? I'm going to get emotional when I'm talking about this, but she said because nobody looked us in the eye, and these kinds of portraits, they force you to look someone who's attempted suicide in the eye and to see that shared humanity. So I just think that that's so beautiful. And so I think we need all the live through thises and all these kinds of projects that give people the opportunity to share their story in a variety of ways. Another piece of this that's been explored in the research of Dr. Bethel Vanderkolk and others, when we're looking at these, at storytelling or at using language or however it might be, theater, improv, you know, even stand-up, particularly theater and improv, though. There's research that Dr. Vanderkolk and others have done showing that particularly sort of group projects where people are doing improv together are tremendously healing for people. There's something about the idea that, like, you are needed to make this collective experience possible, right? And also ways to take risks that feel safe and to be validated and to be seen by your peers, right? All of these different kinds of things are so critically important for people who've struggled with suicide, for people who struggle with trauma. And none of these things have to be like shared with the world. You know, I can tell you, I just wrote privately for years and years before I shared anything with the world, you know, but just that outlet was so critical. And I can tell you, in treatment settings, other than putting things together with popsicle sticks, which you can do like really cool things with popsicle sticks, but that creative, expressive drive was kind of taken away from me. You know, sure, I was handed a journal, but they were like, we're going to read it. So, you know, how therapeutic is that when it's not really even private? So I think the more we can incorporate the arts into our work with people, you know, I think the greater the healing, the greater the empowerment, the greater a sense of mastery over something, right? And that gets back to that internal sense of control over one's life. And then the 3 out of 4 truths of healing from Dr. Vanderkolk, and I love this one. We have the ability to regulate our own physiology, including some of the so-called involuntary functions of the body and brain, through such basic activities as breathing, moving, and touching. And if you had showed me this statement prior to 2004, I would have said, like, you're full of it. Like, I don't care who said that. Like, I'm out of control. I can't regulate my own physiology. Like, I don't know what you're talking about. Because it really did feel that foreign to me, you know, that idea, because I had been told my whole life, you have all of these disorders. Like, there's not a whole lot you can do about them. Like, there's, you know, like, it's meds and it's talk therapy. Like, that's all that we have for you. That's it. And, you know, and those things may work fantastically for people, one or the other or both, but they did not address the roots of my particular issue, which was trauma. And for me, it had to start with this piece around self-awareness and breaking out of that living from the neck up. I just watched this incredible TED Talk by Eve Ensler called I Have a Body, or Suddenly My Body, one of those. If you Google like Eve Ensler body TED Talk, I highly encourage you to listen to it, because she talks about this with more brilliance and beauty than I could ever possibly achieve. But she talks about this process of discovering she had a body and what that did for her. So this idea that, you know, and again, I'm total Bessel van der Kolk groupie, but this idea that physical self-awareness is the first step in releasing the tyranny of the past. And I can tell you from my own experience, that's true. I had been in so much talk therapy. So many times I shared the story. It didn't get the story out of my body. It wasn't until a therapist who was not a talk therapist, but involved body-based kinds of things with me, I'd be, you know, sort of ranting on, and she would say, where do you feel that in your body? And I don't know what you are talking about. I'm pissed right now. I don't feel anything in my body. I don't know what you're talking about. And it took a while. It took a while of her working with me before I was able to feel where my emotions registered physically. And I could start to sense what it felt like when I was getting triggered, and learning to do things to help sort of bring me back down when I'm totally activated and ramped up and acting out of my, you know, fight, flight, and freeze part of my brain, right? All of that, those are skills that I had to learn. They were skills that I did not get until I was in my 30s. If I had gotten them in my teens, I think my life would have been completely different. So I'm a huge, huge believer in this mind-body skills stuff. including mindfulness. I know it's like so overused, and mindfulness and mindfulness this and that, and you're probably sick of hearing that word. But again, like it was just a complete game changer for me. And particularly this last part at the bottom, the observer or witness consciousness. Cultivating that ability to watch my thoughts, to observe my thoughts rather than believe every single thing that ricochets through this brain of mine, right? Being able to cultivate that aspect of myself, it's something like, it's a gift that I still, that to this day, I'm reaping the benefits of, and I will continually. Like just being able to step outside of the chaos in my mind and bring some love, bring some compassion to it. Knowing that everybody else has the same freaking chaos going on in their mind. You know, some of us worse than others, but, you know, Eckhart Tolle had talked about in one of his books, he was in the bathroom and he saw a woman, or outside of the bathroom, or he was in his train station somewhere, and he saw a woman come out of the bathroom, and she was talking to herself. Real, you know, loudly, visibly, you know, talking to herself. And he had this awareness as he listened to her. He's like, that's what all of us do. We just don't say it out loud, but we're just always talking to ourselves in our mind. And there's all this like chaos going on in there, right? And then the last piece that I want to touch on before we get to questions and comments is this fourth truth of healing. And this is really where I say that suicide prevention and trauma-informed care, trauma-informed suicide prevention, you know, these are, to me, I'm speaking for myself, are not just medical issues, nor should we treat them solely as medical issues, but as socio-political issues, which is what gets into this then fourth truth of healing. That was hard to say. We can change social conditions to create environments in which children and adults can feel safe and where they can thrive. You know, this is such a huge piece of it. So much of our field has not focused on that. It's been like in the nature versus nurture equation. Like nurture has been completely shunted to the side, you know, and it's just all nature, it's all genetic, it's all blah, 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 you know, but actually we can create environments where children and adults can feel safe and where they can thrive. And so, you know, this is where I would spend like 3 more hours talking about this, but we're going to wrap up. But I want to leave you with these 4 R's, and I want to refer you to SAMHSA's Concept and Guidance for a Trauma-Informed Approach. If you Google it, it'll pop up. It's a free PDF document that I think really goes into the stuff in a lot more detail. But I like this idea of the 4 R's, right, where, you know, to really say that you're trauma-informed, it's not just enough to know that people are impacted by trauma and that healing is possible. Like, that's great. Like, that's a piece of it. But then the second piece is to recognize what are these signs of trauma in people they are working with, right? What does that look like? You know, if someone's running away, how might that be connected to trauma? If someone is dissociating all the time, how might that be connected to trauma, right? So kind of understanding substance use, all these different things, right? So those are important, but it's the last 2 that are critical. It's the last 2 that are the hardest, because it means you have to really implement change in your agency, your organization, your family, you know, which is to fully integrate knowledge about trauma into the way you do everything, which means to probably change like 98% of the way you do everything, like truly. And so, you know, changing the way you work with people, right? An example, like strip searches are a horrible thing that people have to go through when they are using emergency services, and can be so re-traumatizing for people. You know, and there's agencies that have figured out how to do this in a way that gives, you know, you can't skip the strip search, unfortunately, but there's ways to do this that give people more voice and choice. Like, we can do it now, we can do it later, you can have a female or a male, you know, all these different kinds of things, right? Or at least giving people some more options and choices rather than like strip search now, you know, and then wondering why the person's freaking out, right? And then finally, seeks to resist re-traumatization. So I feel like the example I gave is one way to resist re-traumatization, bringing in peer support so that there's additional folks who sort of understand and can help people navigate what's happening to them, right? All these different ways that we are making this a cornerstone of our work, that we are not going to re-traumatize the people we work with if we can help it. Do everything possible to avoid that outcome. And, I just wanted to share with you, I think now that we've kind of gone through this overview, I encourage you to delve more deeply into the principles of a trauma-informed approach and see what those look like in your whatever setting that, you're working in. How can these things be improved upon? How can there be more collaboration, more empowerment, people having choices and options so that they feel safe, they feel in control, they know what's happening to them, the trustworthiness, right? We know that trauma so often an experience of betrayal, and how our systems are so often not transparent, not explaining to people their options, not explaining what's going to happen to people in full detail, right? So how can we improve that? And I think safety, none of these are supposed to be in a particular order, but I do think safety is first for a reason, because I think it's very hard to get anything accomplished if we don't feel safe, right? That is imperative. And understanding that some of the people that you work with may currently be unsafe, right? And how does that impact the relationship, right? And then all of the cultural, historical, and gender issues that I talked about. Number one, we have to stop misgendering people in services. That is so damaging, so destructive. And I've heard so often from people using services that people refuse to call them by their chosen pronouns. So doing work with many organizations, they have now started asking people, how would you like to be referred to as? They don't assume based on, oops, my startup disk is full. They don't assume based on what that person is presenting, looking like, what gender they want to be referred to as, right? These things may seem like little things, but they're not. They're huge things, right? So in the interest of time, I was going to do a little exercise with you guys about which one of these things you think is the most important, but I think I'll move on so that we'll have more time to talk. And then I just want to touch on, lastly, peer support. I think that this is an area where we need a lot of help in suicide prevention to kind of improve opportunities for peer support. And I think it kind of gets back to some assumptions that, if you don't have a clinical background, that there's certain things you shouldn't touch, which are basically trauma and suicide, right? I disagree. I think we need peer support when it comes to trauma support, and we need it when it comes to support for people who survived attempts. And so there's been some great developments in that field. There's several different models, whether you want to look at D.D. Hirsch, the Samaritan's approach. I love the Alternatives to Suicide peer-to-peer support model. I think it's brilliant and wonderful. And that, that this gets back to that whole issue of connectedness, social support, that these are critical pieces, whether someone's a suicide attempt survivor or has experienced trauma or both. And I just wanted to make sure that you all knew about this resource, which is completely created by attempt survivors or people who struggled with suicidality. It's called The Way Forward. Google it. You can really look through and read all of these great recommendations, as from people with lived experience about how we as a field can improve outcomes and improve the experience for people who are, trying to get help. So to sum up, when I talk about trauma-informed suicide prevention, there's so many things I could talk about with it, but here's just, some of the takeaways that I want to wrap it all up with, which is, collaboration, not doing things to people or for people, but with people whenever possible. So I love CAMS for that reason, because it has collaborative in its name, created by Dr. David Jobs. training all staff in trauma-informed approaches, all of them, including direct care staff, who usually get the least training but have the most contact with people using services. And how that makes sense, I don't know. Incorporating peer support and lived experience in meaningful ways in everything that you do. It will make your programs richer, more vibrant, more relevant. People want to participate in them. It's a win-win. It's empowering for the people involved. Do it, please. Teach mind-body skills, yoga, tai chi, breath work, whatever it might be, so people learn these basic skills of emotional regulation. Like, I'm all about it and all over it. It's so important. And many of our systems are waking up to realize that. And then, again, I talked about this, give people as many opportunities for creative expression as possible, and 9 of them won't resonate with the person, maybe the 10th will. So it's just, really being creative with creative expression. And then finally, coming back to what I talked about, healing happens in relationship. I feel like our healthcare should be on relationship. It should be relationship-based, not billable hours-based, right? So we do what we can within that framework to build in that relationship-based as a cornerstone of what we do. And I just can't finish a presentation without including the words of the late, great Dr. Maya Angelou. I have learned that people will forget what you said, they will forget what you did, but they will never forget how you made them feel. And every single one of us has the capacity to be that person for someone else, that unforgettable person who has really, truly made an impact and made a difference. So with that, we have like 9 minutes and went a little bit over, but I'm happy to take any questions, comments, observations, reflections. And Heidi, I don't know if people have the option to get on the phone also. Oh, looks like the chat box isn't working. Okay. So yeah, Heidi, can you hear me? Can anyone hear me?
Hi, Leah?
Oh, yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I was having trouble. My screen froze halfway through.
Oh, no.
I ended up getting my old computer. That was just working. It just froze right now. So you had people were responding, but because my screen was frozen, you couldn't see it.
Sorry, guys.
Yeah. So I'm trying to see if there are. Okay. Can we get a copy of the slides?
Absolutely.
Okay. And let's see, I'm trying to see. Oh my gosh, I am just like. I'm not seeing any other new questions. I was seeing the first all the answers to your question, to your like polls people had. I am so sorry, everyone. I know you were having trouble and with chatting and us, and so that was on me. That was my computer.
Oh, no worries.
But I'm not seeing questions off the top of my head. Let me just double check.
Okay.
If anyone raised their hand.
Well, oh, here we go. If you think of questions, this is how you can reach me. There's lots of ways to reach me. Like I say, I'm not that active on Twitter.
Okay. First of all, I want to say that if people could email me, Heidi@HeidiBryan.com, who wants the slides? You know, Leah, you can give me the PDF and I'll send them out to people. So that's that. There's a question, if racism is identified as chronic stressor, why do you feel the effects of racism is downplayed in our society, in this country specifically?
Oh, yeah. So I wouldn't say that the effects of racism are played down in this country. In fact, I think that there's a greater discussion about racism than ever before, which I think is fantastic. But what I was saying is that understanding racism as a chronic stressor that like messes up people's health, that's a conversation that hasn't been quite as open, right? I mean, we know that racism is damaging in a million different ways, but sort of understanding the specific health consequences of living in a racist society, that's kind of the newer piece, if that makes sense.
Okay. Hopefully. I'm not seeing any other hands, I don't think. Oh, wait, here, there's another question. When we communicate with the public, how can we speak about trauma and suicide prevention?
That's a great, that's a wonderful question. I think just to say that, I mean, this is my suggestion, but to say that this is a dimension, that the sort of effects of trauma is a dimension of suicide prevention that we need to be looking at more carefully. Or we need to look more carefully at the intersection between childhood, adult trauma, and suicide attempt, death by suicide. So yeah, that it's kind of like a missing link, maybe. I'm trying to figure out how to be concise about it, but I hope that that's helpful. That's the way I've been talking about it, is that we need to bring an understanding of trauma more deeply into all of our work in suicide care. And in mental health and substance use overall, and in all of our systems and in our whole world, yeah, basically everywhere.
I agree. And just do it. Don't ask a question, just do it.
Let's do it. Just do it.
I'm trying to see. And Beth said thank you. The person who asked me, Beth, so she said thank you. Oh, here's a great one. You rock, Leah. Thank you.
Oh, thank you.
Is there a way to review the seminar again? Yes, link it is being recorded, and a link will be sent out to everyone. So.
Yeah, and you can send out, Heidi. You're welcome to send out the PowerPoint to everyone too.
Okay.
Whatever works.
Okay. Great presentation. Very helpful information from Andy.
Thank you.
Such an important topic. Thanks. Let me see if there's anything else. There's so many things that I was like nodding my head, and when you were talking and everything. And when you said about your grandmother said about you being damaged goods. My mother didn't call me damaged goods, but she referred to a young person who we knew who had the exact same circumstances as myself. And she said, oh, she's damaged goods and there's no hope for her. And I mean, I'm looking at her like, oh, so that's what you think about me too. Great.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah. It was just such a like people just took that for granted, that once you're damaged, that's it.
Yeah. So I am not seeing any other questions. I thought it was great. I loved it. I know I want to listen to it again.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, this is my favorite subject to talk about, more or less. And I do truly mean it, that if you think of questions or anything, do feel free to reach out to me. I do all different million kinds of trainings, and you can see on my website some of the things that I offer. If your organization is looking for help as well, you can reach out to the National Center for Trauma-Informed Care. That's another option, and I do work with them as well. So options for further training and study are around, available.
Okay, there's another question came in from John. How do we get more attempt survivors to the table?
Well, I think inviting them to the table, making the table attractive, yes. And it's also helpful to have more than one person involved, so that person doesn't feel like the sort of token or the only one. You know, figure out if you're having meetings at times where people can't come, and change your meeting times. You know, figure out what is it that's keeping people. If you are inviting people and they're not coming, find out why. You know, maybe there's some practical thing, a transportation issue that can be addressed, whatever it might be. But just kind of having that curiosity, not assuming that people aren't showing up because they don't care or whatever. There may be compelling reasons. But first, we got to invite them. Second, we have to make that table inviting. I hope that's helpful.
And if they're having trouble identifying who attempt survivors are, they could probably connect with a crisis center or someplace, or call.
Sure. Yeah, or if there's any like peer-run organizations in your state, or whatever they call it, consumer or whatever, that, you know, any kind of peer-run agency that you can partner with. Almost every state has at least one, so that's an idea too.
So we hope we answered your question, John. Well, it's what time? 1:30, 1:31. I think it doesn't seem like we're getting any more questions. So I guess we can end the webinar. And again, Leah, thank you. It was great. It was everything I knew it would be and more.
Well, thank you for having me. Yeah.
And hopefully, I mean, the response was overwhelming. This webinar filled up almost immediately. Hopefully this will lead to more on this topic, because I think there's a definite interest and a need. So
that would be awesome. I'd love it.
And thank you everyone who hung in there to the very end, even with my chat box and question and answer issues going on that we've solved. So
awesome.
Thank
you, everyone.
Everyone, and have a great day.
Take care. Bye.